The world had always seen America not simply as a nation, but as a living dream. It was the promise of neon nights in Times Square, the magic kingdoms of Orlando, the golden Pacific sunsets of California, and the thundering canyons carved over millennia. For generations, travelers from every continent crossed oceans just to stand on its soil. It wasn't just sightseeing, it was pilgrimage. The Statue of Liberty wasn't only a monument, it was a beacon. Route 66 wasn't only a highway, it was a story written in asphalt and dust. America had sold itself to the world not as a destination, but as an idea, and the idea was irresistible. But dreams can shatter quietly, almost invisibly at first. What arrived was not an earthquake or a hurricane, but a series of travel bans inked onto paper with cold certainty. They were framed as shields, as walls of protection against threats real and imagined. Yet behind the speeches and signatures was a chain reaction no one wanted to admit. At first, the bans looked temporary, even theatrical, but in the veins of the tourism industry, they began bleeding the lifeblood away. The airports felt it first. Hubs that once vibrated with the chatter of every language on Earth grew eerily still. International terminals, once seas of rolling suitcases and flashing arrival boards, shrank into hollow caverns echoing with footsteps. Planes were grounded, rows of silver giants lined up like silent monuments to a past era. For pilots, attendants, and ground crews, the uncertainty was brutal. These were not numbers on a spreadsheet. These were lives tethered to an industry that suddenly had no passengers. Then the silence spread to hotels. Grand lobbies designed for perpetual arrival stood empty beneath glittering chandeliers. In Las Vegas, fountains danced with no one watching. In Miami, beachside resorts became empty fortresses staring blankly at the sea. Housekeepers folded sheets in rooms that would remain untouched. Bellhops leaned on carts waiting for luggage that never arrived. Even the iconic city that never slept began to yawn with exhaustion as tourists vanished from its streets. But the collapse was never contained to airplanes and hotel keys. Tourism was a living chain, and when one link snapped, everything followed. Restaurants once alive with the accents of foreign guests became graveyards of silent tables. Broadway theaters dimmed their lights, their marquees glowing for crowds that never came. Street performers who once gathered cheers performed only for pigeons, their applause reduced to the hollow clap of their own hands against brick. In Florida, theme parks once brimming with wonder became eerie playgrounds of empty rides, the laughter of children replaced by mechanical whirs echoing into the sky. Beyond the obvious, the shockwaves dug deeper. Farmers who supplied fresh food to bustling hotels and restaurants now watched produce rot unsold. Small towns built on seasonal visitors, ski resorts in the Rockies, fishing harbors in Alaska, vineyards in California, felt their identities unravel. Their livelihoods had never depended on politics, yet politics had decided their fate. And in the strangest twist, while America closed its doors, the rest of the world flung theirs wide open. Paris painted itself brighter, welcoming families who once dreamed of New York. Dubai glittered with futuristic skylines, stealing the gamblers who once flocked to Las Vegas. Tokyo's theme parks overflowed, while Orlando's grew quiet. London's theaters sold out while Broadway grew dim. The crown of global tourism was not stolen, it was abandoned. The most unsettling part was the truth revealed beneath the numbers. Billions were lost, millions of jobs erased, but the bans achieved little of their promised purpose. Security did not transform. Borders did not become unbreakable. The supposed gains were illusions, while the damage was devastatingly real. America had not been attacked by rivals. It had wounded itself. And perception. Perception was the wound that bled the longest. Once seen as the world's welcome mat, America now looked like a fortress, suspicious of outsiders, closed to the very lifeblood it once thrived on. Families abroad rewrote their dreams. Why risk rejection at a U.S. airport when Europe, Asia, or the Middle East offered open arms? Every empty seat on a flight, every darkened hotel window, was not just lost revenue, it was a lost piece of identity. The whispers began, first soft, then louder. Was America still the land of opportunity? Could it still call itself the epicenter of the world's adventures? Newspapers around the globe asked if the dream was dead, if the doors had closed forever. And inside America, protests began to stir. Workers carried signs not of politics, but survival. They marched through streets demanding jobs, not ideology. Waiters, drivers, guides, performers. They all shouted the same desperate plea, "Open the doors before it's too late." The silence that followed was louder than any crowd. Empty skies, empty streets, empty dreams. The world watched, and the world moved on. What began as a slow bleed soon erupted into a nationwide fracture. The travel bans were no longer headlines. They were wounds carved into the daily lives of millions. In Congress, senators spoke with grim urgency, their voices echoing through chambers once filled with routine debates. Governors of states dependent on tourism pleaded for relief, waving charts that showed beaches deserted, hotels boarded, entire industries hollowed. But in the noise of politics, their cries were drowned out. Wall Street felt the tremor next. Investors pulled out of hotel chains, airlines, and entertainment giants with ruthless precision. Stocks that had once been blue-chip pillars tumbled into panic territory. Theme parks shelved billion-dollar expansions. Luxury developers canceled resorts mid-construction, leaving steel skeletons rusting against the horizon. To the markets, the message was clear. Tourism in America was no longer a safe bet. The shock spread beyond finance, signaling to the world that even the United States could topple under the weight of its own decisions. Meanwhile, foreign capitals celebrated what America had abandoned. In Paris, hotel occupancy soared as visitors diverted their trips. Singapore's airports expanded, welcoming travelers that once funneled through Los Angeles or New York. Morocco rebranded itself as the new gateway for cultural adventure, stealing the mystique once owned by Washington and San Francisco. America's rivals didn't just take the opportunity, they orchestrated campaigns to exploit it. Billboards across Europe and Asia gleamed with slogans of openness, warmth, and inclusion, quietly contrasting themselves against America's silence. But the deepest damage was invisible, buried in perception. Once, to visit America was to collect stories. Stories of Broadway lights, of road trips under vast skies, of standing beneath monuments that defined freedom. Now the stories told were darker. Families spoke of canceled visas after months of saving, of interrogations at airports, of trips cut short by suspicion. Those stories spread faster than brochures ever could. For every traveler turned away, dozens more chose never to risk it. Trust had been fractured, and trust was the one currency tourism could never afford to lose. Communities built on generations of visitors began to unravel. Coastal towns that thrived on summer crowds resembled ghost villages. Mountain resorts, once packed with winter adventurers, now echoed with empty chairlifts. Tour guides fluent in 5 languages turned to odd jobs, their voices silenced by a lack of guests. Taxi drivers polished their cars every morning, only to return home with meters untouched. Each life carried the same ache, an identity stolen not by disaster, but by decree. And through it all, the paradox deepened. To some, the bans looked like strength, proof of a nation willing to stand alone. To others, they were the clearest sign of weakness, a superpower retreating into fear. The divide wasn't just political, it was philosophical. What did America stand for? Was it a fortress, or was it a beacon? Dictator or savior, protector or destroyer? The questions echoed across dinner tables, classrooms, and editorial pages. The answers grew more fractured with every passing year. Globally, The narrative shifted in ways that could not be undone. Diplomats admitted in quiet corridors what they never dared in public. America no longer looked like the dependable partner it once was. Soft power, the ability to shape hearts and minds through culture and presence, had withered. Where once every family dreamed of a vacation in the United States, now they dreamed elsewhere. The world had options, and America was no longer the first choice. The final discovery was the most haunting of all. Analysts warned that even if the bans vanished tomorrow, the damage to perception could last decades. Tourism, unlike steel or oil, was built on feelings of safety, welcome, wonder. And once those feelings shifted, they rarely returned. Children who grew up visiting Paris, Dubai, or Tokyo would not wake up as adults dreaming of New York. Families who chose Europe over America once would likely choose it again. In the end, the bans had done what no rival could achieve. They had dimmed the nation's light, not by force from outside, but by choices within. Empty airports, shuttered hotels, silenced theaters. They weren't just signs of economic collapse. They were symbols of a story rewritten, of a nation closing the very doors that had once made it great. And as the world moved forward, the question remained suspended in silence. Was this the stumble of a giant who would rise again, or the moment history would remember as the beginning of America's retreat into its own shadow?